I'm going to be reading some select passages from 2 Kings 11. Let's hear the word of the Lord together. When Athaliah, the mother of Ahaziah, saw that her son was dead, she arose and destroyed all the royal heirs. But Jehosheba, the daughter of King Joram, sister of Ahaziah, took Joash, the son of Ahaziah, and stole him away from among the king's sons who were being murdered. And they hid him and his nurse in the bedroom from Athaliah, so that he was not killed. So he was hidden with her in the house of the Lord for 6 years, while Athaliah reigned over the land. In the 7th year, Jehoiada sent and brought the captains of hundreds of the bodyguards and the escorts, and brought them into the house of the Lord to him. And he made a covenant with them, and took an oath from them in the house of the Lord, and showed them the king's son. Then he commanded them, saying, "This is what you shall do. 1/3 of you who come on duty on the Sabbath shall be keeping watch over the king's house. 1/3 shall be at the gate of Sur, and 1/3 at the gate behind the escorts. You shall keep the watch of the house, lest it be broken down. The 2 contingents of you who go off duty on the Sabbath shall keep the watch of the house of the Lord for the king. But you shall surround the king on all sides, every man with his weapons in his hand, and whoever comes within range, let him be put to death. You are to be with the king as he goes out and as he comes in." So the captains of the hundreds did according to all that Jehoiada the priest commanded. Each of them took his men who were to be on duty on the Sabbath with those who were going off duty on the Sabbath, and came to Jehoiada the priest. And the priest gave the captains of hundreds the spears and shields which had belonged to King David, that were in the temple of the Lord. Then the escort stood, every man with his weapons in his hand, all around the king, from the right side of the temple to the left side of the temple, by the altar and the house. And he brought out the king's son, put the crown on him, and gave him the testimony. They made him king and anointed him, and they clapped their hands and said, "Long live the king!" Now when Athaliah heard the noise of the escorts and the people, she came to the people in the temple of the Lord. When she looked, there was the king, standing by a pillar according to custom. And the elders and trumpeters were by the king. All the people of the land were rejoicing and blowing trumpets. So Athaliah tore her clothes and cried out, "Treason! Treason!" And Jehoiada the priest commanded the captains of the hundreds, the officers of the army, and said to them, "Take her outside under guard and slay with the sword whoever follows her." For the priest had said, "Do not let her be killed in the house of the Lord." So they seized her, and she went by way of the horses' entrance into the king's house, and there she was killed. Then Jehoiada made a covenant between the Lord, the king, and the people, that they should be the Lord's people, and also between the king and the people. And all the people of the land went to the temple of Baal and tore it down. They thoroughly broke it in pieces, its altars and images, and killed Mattan, the priest of Baal, before the altars. And the priest appointed officers over the house of the Lord. Then he took the captains of hundreds, the bodyguards and escorts, and all the people of the land, and they brought the king down from the house of the Lord, and went by way of the gate of the escorts to the king's house. Then he sat on the throne of the kings. So all the people of the land rejoiced, and the city was quiet, for they had slain Athaliah with the sword in the king's house. Jehoash was 7 years old when he became king. Well, contrary to popular notions, the Bible is not a book of myths, fables, or legends. Instead, It's the historical record about a real God, real people, and spiritual truth. It relates the details of actual events for a singular purpose. What's the purpose? To make us wise unto salvation. Even when some of those details that it shares may send a chill up our spine. The account of the boy king Joash is one such narrative. He was only 7 years old when he became anointed king over the southern kingdom of Judah. His life is a study in influences, good and bad. And the good won out over the bad, but not without God's intervention in the form of timely and wise adults who surrounded this young boy. Joash was a good king. He eventually reigned for 40 years in Jerusalem. But to get this young child to the age of 7 was no easy feat, because you see, he was the target of an assassin. But God had his people, and they came with skill and wisdom. Let's identify first the influence of the would-be assassin. Her name is Athaliah. She's one of the most chilling figures ever to walk across the pages of Scripture. It helped that she came from bad stock. She was the daughter of the most notorious couple in biblical history, King Ahab and his wife, Queen Jezebel. It was they who introduced pagan worship into Israel, intending it to displace the worship of the one true God, Yahweh. They not only introduced it, they promoted it, and they ruthlessly enforced it. Yeah, Athaliah was a chip off the old block. Her influence personified the influence of the world, the flesh, and the devil. That's what I think of when I think of Athaliah. She dedicated herself to seeing Baal worship flourish in Judah, just as her mother Jezebel had saw to it flourishing in Israel, the northern kingdom. What's worse, Athaliah was a mother. I'm sorry to say that. She and her husband, King Jehoram, had several sons. However, the Arabs killed all her sons except one named Ahaziah. When Ahaziah became king at the age of 22, he followed the example set by both his mother, Athaliah, and his grandmother, Jezebel. I think you've heard it said, as the twig is bent, so grows the tree. Well, the coaching from his mother, Ahaziah, promoted Baalism, and he cooperated with Joram, the king of Israel. But Athaliah's son lasted only a year on the throne of Judah before being killed in battle. Now, although Ahaziah had sons of his own, none were old enough to take the throne after he was killed. So here's what happened. His mother, Athaliah, seized power and proceeded to exterminate the royal household of Judah. She murdered all her own grandchildren. Her goal was to wipe out the Davidic dynasty, and she came frighteningly close to succeeding it. Only one infant escaped her murderous rampage. And that was due, again, to God's intervention in the form of a caring couple, husband and wife. We'll meet them in a moment, but first, the truth is this. We live in a day when the influence of Athaliah is alive and well. It's all around us. Influences which are a direct threat to the souls of unborn infants, children, young people. Everything in the form of abortion on demand, militant social re-indoctrination programs supported by the government, plus the ordinary problems of kidnapping, child abuse, abandonment, and neglect. It should be enough to create alarm and outrage among everybody, but especially among God's people, the Christian community. It should stir righteous indignation and anger in the church of Jesus Christ and make us recommit ourselves to making sure that the children in our care are protected. It should move us to practical and prudent action. And thankfully, God has strategically placed his people in the world, and he prepares us and he empowers us to act at just the right time. Now that brings us to the second influence in the boy king Joash's early development. It was this godly couple. Jehosheba was the half-sister of Ahaziah, Athaliah's son, who had become king and died in battle. And she was the wife of Jehoiada, the priest of the Lord. And unbeknown to wicked Athaliah, Jehosheba smuggled her infant nephew, the king-to-be, Joash, into her apartment, her and her husband's apartment, in the temple, along with Joash's nurse, and kept them in protective custody. Not for 1 year, not for 2 years, not for 3 years, but for 6 years. Now, since Athaliah clung to idolatry, her life was all about idolatry. She would not have no interest in the temple, so it would be a safe hiding place. Meanwhile, during those 6 years, Athaliah went on the warpath. She ramped up worship of Baal, and she did her best to spread it and enforce it. She even appointed someone named Mattan to be her own personal high priest of Baal. Can you imagine? Well, let's stop there. This sounds like where we're at. This sounds like modern history. The Athaliah campaign to displace Judeo-Christian worldview is now in full swing. Even as we speak, the campaign is focused mainly on attacking one thing above everything else, and that is what? The institution of the family. They also work at redefining sexuality and dictating a new program of socialization. Broad-minded. It's really the same old fertility cult of Baal worship. It's just that it's disguised in modern clothing. It targets the smallest unit of society, the family, because common sense says if you can succeed in redefining the family, society will have to follow. You won't even have to work at it. It's very intentionally focused on indoctrinating the youngest, and it's happening in our public school systems around the country. It attempts to captivate their young minds and make them think that deviance is normal. You know what? It may be helpful at this point to stop and note that the setting in which Jesus was around people, and people were bringing their children to Jesus to lay his hands on them and bless them, and the disciples felt that they were distracting Jesus, and they started to stop them. And Jesus says, don't do that. Don't stop parents from bringing their children to me. That incident followed immediately on Jesus' teaching about marriage and divorce. Now, the Pharisees, you remember, they were always trying to catch Jesus in some kind of a verbal trap, and they had attempted to throw Jesus a curveball by asking him to comment on whether it's okay for a man to divorce his wife or not. It was a loaded question. It was meant to entrap Jesus because the rabbis of that day were divided on what constituted legal grounds for divorce. One school of the rabbis said divorce is permissible only in one case, sexual infidelity. Meanwhile, the other school, the other rabbinic school, was much more lenient, and it allowed for all sorts of frivolous grounds for divorce. And rather than aligning himself with either rabbinic school, either position, Jesus went right back to Genesis 1:27, and he said, here's what you need. Here's what you're missing. Haven't you ever read in the scriptures? Jesus said. They record that from the beginning, God made them what? Male and female. No other categories. Then Jesus said, this explains why a man leaves his father and his mother and is joined to his wife, and they too are united into one. Since they are no longer two but one, let no one split apart what God has joined together. My, I see a lot of splitting going on today. And I don't mean hair splitting. We mustn't assume that God wants everyone to marry, because Jesus is very clear in the rest of the passage that there are good reasons to remain single. But having said that, Jesus also cited the original purpose of God in creation, that husband and wife should be one flesh. And that spiritual kinship, or that intimate fellowship that they experience, is to find legitimate expression physically through the human body as the medium. Now we're being told that that's a denial of human freedom. Now we see that God's arrangement is oppressive and dangerous. And you know who suffers from this twisted thinking? It's children. Children born of a loving union between a married man and a married woman, as God created them at birth, sets the stage for a happy and congenial home for that child. There is a balance of the sexes in the way God designed marriage that help to give a little child the physical, the mental, the emotional, and the spiritual support and stability that they need. No other arrangement made by man can improve upon God's original design. God forbid, but let every man be a liar. Then those parents can bring that child to Jesus for blessing in salvation. See, when it comes to adults, Jesus said, compel them to come in. But when it comes to children, Jesus said, let them come unto me. Children tend to feel their need of God much more readily than do adults. They will come to the Savior if parents will take the time to lead them and to nurture them in that direction. They will come to Jesus. And what's more, children are unique in this: they have their whole lives ahead of them to give to the Lord. Now you think of this Bible, and you think of the Apostle Paul, and you think what would have happened if, instead of coming to Jesus Christ when he was maybe somewhere in his late 20s, instead of that happening, Paul came to Jesus at the age of 70. Well, we don't even know that he lived that long. He was beheaded. Would we have all of those letters from the Apostle Paul if he hadn't come to the Lord early in life? What if Matthew Henry, the great British theologian and Bible commentator, what if instead of being converted at 11, he was converted at 81? What about the great hymn writer, Isaac Watts? What if instead of being converted at 9 as he was converted at 90? What about that premier Puritan preacher, Jonathan Edwards? What if instead of being converted at 8 years old like he was converted at 80? And we know he didn't even live that long. What if Richard Baxter, who was converted at 6, had really been converted at 60? So many of us, all we can bring to Jesus is what's left. But children, they're different. they can bring to Jesus their whole lives. Now, back to this matter of the family and the whole idea of God's design for the sexes. Please keep in mind that regardless of how one feels about his or her gender, feelings are suspect. Truth is not. Forever, O Lord, thy word is settled in heaven. There aren't going to be any new revisions of this book. This is it. Jesus went back to the Bible for clarity in answering the moral dilemmas of his day. And so better we. Presumed social experimentation, wherever it happens, and social engineering are not only unnecessary, they are a direct affront to God's glory. Now, all through those 6 years of Athaliah's indoctrination measures into Baal worship, while baby Joash and his nurse were in hiding, the high priest of the Lord, Jehoiada, and his wife Jehosheba were no doubt a great blessing to this young child. And we need adults, bold and brave, who will intervene like that in situations today. Couples who take an interest in the future of the country and have the courage to take risks and act decisively to protect their children from the confused spiritual and moral climate of the culture are wise parents indeed. It begins with taking a personal interest in one child, and that child may be in the church or in the extended church family. It may be a grandchild of yours. It may be a nephew or a niece who could and should be in the church but is not. Now, as God's people, we can't sit on the sidelines and just hope that society will turn around. Edmund Burke, in a letter in the 1700s to Thomas Mercer, said, "The only thing necessary for evil to triumph is for good men to do nothing." Just sit back. Society will fall apart by itself. Evil will triumph. Needless to say, children are like wet cement. Whatever and whoever touches them makes a lasting impression, for good or ill. They face the very real danger of being swept into this constant current of moral relativism. You know what I'm talking about. Being systematically indoctrinated into the idea that there is absolutely no absolute truth. Isn't it interesting? How can you say that? You're making a contradiction. But essentially, what we're being told is to each his own, and the rest of us should act like well-programmed robots and politely reply, who am I to judge? Question. Will we or will we not recommit ourselves as Christian adults not to vacillate on this matter of social indoctrination as if it were a benign fashion, sort of like wearing argyle socks? I assure you, it's not benign. It's deadly. It's demonic. And it has to be repelled and rebuffed with the unvarnished truth and the authority of God's infallible word. Do we or do we not believe Jesus Christ? In John 8:32, you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. Or the old hymn, the Bible stands every test we give it, for its author is divine. By grace alone I will expect to live it, and to prove it and make it mine. Where are the Jehoshebas and the Jehoiadas today? And I'm quite amazed that I didn't get tongue-tied in saying those names. What happened next in the life of this boy king is the result of no less greater prudence on the part of this godly couple. because it's not specifically stated here, but we can assume that during those 6 years that the boy king was in hiding, Jehoiada and his wife instructed this little boy in the laws of God. Nothing could be more important for a father or mother to do. The Bible should be something as familiar to them as milk. The child should develop a taste for the exciting stories of the Bible and its heroes and its deep lessons, even from infancy. Eventually, the day came when it was time to bring this boy king out of hiding and to present him now as the next king of Judah before the people. And right now you might be thinking, I mean, what kind of a king could a boy 7 years old be in this kind of a society? I mean, come on. Isn't age 7, isn't that the age where little boys are always getting into mischief and have to be reprimanded and scolded by their parents? Well, the answer to your quandary is that he could effectively lead the nation with the help of his mother Zibiah, and furthermore, it was the influence of this priest of the Lord, Jehoiada, and his wife that helped to set the groundwork for Joash's thinking, so that during his lifetime, he would not only bring in reform, he would bring a revival to the nation. He would outlaw, he would eliminate Baal worship. He would spread the news through the land that everything associated with Baal worship was to be torn down and burnt. And the worship of the one true God was to be restored. He cleaned house over those 40 years. And the first order of business for us today is this: will we recommit ourselves to the covenant like those people did? It was the righteous, you see, who were to rule the nation. The covenant was meant to serve as a constitution for the nation, but don't forget, it had been virtually ignored for almost 100 years. I wonder if that's true of some of us this Mother's Day. We're not really living up to our godly heritage. Our faith once was hot, but now it's either cool or cold. Our faith was once a formidable force in our lives, but now it's become something weak and uncompelling, unconvincing. There's a story about an interstate motorist. He was tooling down the highway, and he came upon a woman. She was standing beside her car, as we've all seen this familiar scenario along the highway. She was standing off the shoulder, and the man stopped, and he noticed that she had a flat tire, and he offered his assistance, and she thanked him. He got right down to work changing the flat, and she said, "Oh, thank you." She said, I don't know a blessed thing about changing tires. And he said, you don't have to, ma'am. He said reassuringly, it's no job for a lady. And after this Good Samaritan had tightened all the lug nuts on the wheel, he was on the last lug nut, and he was ready to release the jack and lower it. And the woman put her hand to the mouth, put her hand to her mouth, and she said, but please, she said, put the jack down gently. And the man looked at her, and she said, my husband's taking a nap in the back seat. It's okay, folks, you can laugh. Perhaps there is a good reason, though, that our society has degenerated so rapidly, so quickly in the past 15 years. Perhaps the reason lies with those of us who profess to have a faith that is a working faith, a compelling faith. Now, I know it's Mother's Day, and that's the point. Men, I wonder if some of us have been napping in the back seat. don't we have an obligation to make Mother's Day something more than a one-day-a-year sweet romantic sentiment? Should we not strive to make it our goal to keep things from going flat, to keep our prayers from going flat, to keep our worship from going flat, to keep our personal devotional life from going flat? Isn't raising a child of the King of Kings the greatest enterprise that could be known to a man or a woman? I think it is. And I think when we realize the far-reaching potential of touching one child's life for Jesus Christ, we'll look at the heroes of faith in the Old and the New Testament, and we'll remember Timothy and Paul's words to Timothy. You have known from your childhood the Scriptures, which are able to make you wise unto salvation. Wouldn't it be great if we could say of every child that ever passed through this church, that ever sat in these pews, that ever went out into those rooms and bathrooms and teaching stations, that we could say of them, you were made wise unto salvation because you had a mother and father that put the emphasis where it needed to be. Right here. May God help us to recommit ourselves to that goal.